Hi there, I'm Kona Gallagher.
And I'm Ethan Flick.
And together, we are the husband and wife team behind And Then They Were Gone, a true crime podcast about unsolved missing persons cases. Each week, we take a deep dive into a case that I have researched and written about and that you have never heard of.
Right. And I react naturally and usually leave you with a whole lot of stuff to edit out of the podcast.
Very true. But I do love getting your analysis and a fresh perspective on these crimes that I've been spending so much time learning about. So you can see us on your favorite podcast app every Wednesday when we release a brand new episode.
And find us on the socials at ATTWGpod.
And you can also visit us on our website, andthentheyweregone.com.
Could you hold the key to bringing someone home?
Autumn's Oddities is a strange and unusual podcast made by the strange and unusual, me, Autumn Gruby. Each week, I'll be taking you through some of the creepiest cases true crime has to offer. It won't only be true crime, I'll also be covering cryptids, haunted places, haunted things, and the true stories that inspired horror movies. Listen every Monday and Friday for new episodes. And remember, if it's creepy and weird, you'll find it here.
I'm Edward October, creator-host of Octoberpod, and we're both listening to Cause of Death on the Darkcast network.
Cause of Death 100 Seconds to Midnight portrays imagery of death, war, and destruction, and may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Hello, and welcome to Cause of Death 100 Seconds to Midnight. I'm your host, Jackie Moranti. Let's get the business part out of the way real quick so that we can move on to the show. I still want to do a Q&A episode during August, so if anyone wants to ask questions, you can contact me on the socials or at my website at www.causeofdeath100sex.net. Feel free to message me and ask questions. Links to the various ways that you can contact me are all listed in the show notes, too. This episode is going to be a bonus episode, so it's not going to interfere with the normal episodes. It's just something that I'm throwing out there. I'm trying to avoid just reading you my resume. It's very impressively boring. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about me, what got me started doing Cause of Death, my dog, who is also my co-producer, and some other fun things. So I would love to get questions from all of you. Besides, the website is pretty cool, so you should all go take a look. There are several ways to support the show. I have a Patreon, and you can buy me a coffee. You can rate the show. But the best way to support me is to listen, subscribe, and share this podcast with all your friends. Okay, so let's dig in. I love this season. These diseases are a little more fun to talk about since there's so much history, and I've been wanting to do this one for a while. Today, I've got stories about typhoid fever, another old disease that has some very interesting history behind it. We'll begin, of course, with etiology and pathology. Salmonella typhi is a gram-negative, facultative anaerobic, non-spore-forming, motile, rod-shaped bacillus that causes enteric fever. S. typhi has a tail, called a flagellum, and that's what promotes motility. S. typhi and S. paratyphi are caused by the Salmonella enterica subspecies 1 cerevar, that has adapted to the human host. All Salmonella species are members of the Enterobacteriaceae family. The virulence of Salmonella is determined by the typhoid toxin, VI antigen or the polysaccharide capsule, the liposaccharide O antigen, and the H flagellar antigen. If a strain is positive for the VI antigen, it will have twice the attack rate of a strain that is negative for the VI antigen. And the VI antigen is present in Salmonella typhi. I want you to all go back to the very first Q&A episode that I did. In that episode, I explained the immune system like it was two opposing forces in a war. And if you use that imagery here, you can imagine how typhoid fever infects the gut. The VI antigen acts as an anti-phagocytic agent, so it prevents the macrophages from doing their job to protect the body. This also shields the bacterial O antigen from any antibodies that confer serum resistance. The flagellar H antigen, remember the tail? That's what moves the bacterium along, and it helps it adhere to the gut wall mucosa. Invasion of the gut wall is assisted by the flagella, and then the type 3 secretion system will transfer the bacterial protein into the enterocytes and the M cells. M cells are antigen-presenting cells. However, sometimes they don't need to go through all of this. There's just a direct penetration of the gut mucosa and they're in. They've breached the gut. So the bacteria attached to the M cells are absorbed by the cytoplasm containing bacteria. Then they are extruded into the luminal space. The M cells are damaged during all of this and the basal lamina is exposed. This provides easy access for pathogens to invade farther, and then the condition itself becomes much worse. The bacteria continue to proliferate in the Peyer's patches. Necrosis is induced and eventually ulceration occurs. Since the pathogen travels through the bloodstream, multiple organs can be involved, mostly the gallbladder. The end result is shock, vascular hyperactivity, focal necrosis, and hemorrhage. Okay, now before we get too far into this, yes, typhoid fever is caused by a Salmonella species, but there are other Salmonella species. Typhoid fever itself causes the highest rate of morbidity and mortality in humans, with about a 10% morbidity and a 30% mortality rate in untreated patients. But it's not the only Salmonella species out there that can cause illness. Next season, I'll be talking quite a bit about other Salmonella species when we talk about foodborne diseases. Okay, back to typhoid fever. Patients will usually present with a prolonged fever that occurs in a stepwise pattern. Other symptoms include headache, abdominal discomfort, and general lethargy. If the disease goes untreated, several organs can become involved. When we consider any foodborne disease, we think about the 4 F's: fingers, flies, feces, and fomites. You will hear a lot about that next season. And yes, it's gross. And yes, you'll be inspecting kitchens in restaurants before you order. S. typhi is spread through the fecal-oral route. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. It's a disease that is restricted to humans. It's carried by contaminated water, undercooked food, fomites of infected patients, and is far more common in places where sanitation is poor, there is severe overcrowding, and malnutrition is prevalent. Normal flora in the gut can help stave off many foodborne diseases. But when people are suffering from malnutrition, the normal flora doesn't grow properly, so they don't have the natural defenses that healthy people have. People with immune disorders such as HIV are also more susceptible to typhoid fever than healthy people. Those who were previously or still are on antibiotic regimens for another condition may also become more susceptible to typhoid fever. Some antibiotics will also destroy the normal flora of the gut. If the patient has a history of taking antacids and antihistamines, this can also affect the colonization of typhoid fever, since the gastric acids in the stomach can help stave off infection, and those medications affect the normal gastric acids. Other factors that affect pathogenesis are virulence and infectious dose. The larger the infectious dose, the shorter the incubation period, and the higher the attack rate. People traveling to areas of the world where typhoid fever is endemic can receive a vaccine as a prophylaxis. However, the vaccine only has a 50 to 80% efficacy rate. So, good hygiene and avoidance of exposure are still key. If the disease is caught early, antibiotics can be administered as a cure, but since there are several multi-drug resistant strains in endemic areas of the world, the cure can involve cocktails of several drugs to ensure that the bacteria have been eliminated in the patient. Diseases that present with symptoms such as diarrhea, dysentery, abdominal dissension, fever, splenomegaly, and shock mirror typhoid fever, and diagnoses are often confused. Dengue fever, malaria, ambiasis, leptospirosis, Q fever, tularemia, melioidosis, remember that one, giardiasis, bacterial gastroenteritis, rickettsial infection, toxoplasmosis, tuberculosis, and brucellosis are often confused with typhoid fever on initial examination. So, PCR testing is recommended to ensure a proper diagnosis. Typhoid fever is endemic in South Asia and most African countries. Most of the morbidity and mortality occurs in these areas. Higher availability of treatment in these areas has helped the mortality rate, but there's still a long way to go. So now we come to the history part of typhoid. There are historians who believe that typhoid caused a widespread plague in Athens in 430 BC. 1/3 of the population died in the area, including Pericles, who was the leader at the time. His successor, Thucydides, contracted the same disease, but he survived it. Between 1607 and 1624, a suspected typhoid outbreak killed more than 6,000 settlers in Jamestown, Virginia, essentially wiping out the entire colony. In 1643, English physician Thomas Willis described typhoid fever in Treatise on Fevers. French pathologist Pierre Bretonneau described the intestinal lesions of typhoid. He also attempted to clarify the pathology of the disease in 1826. William Wood Gerhard noted the differences between typhus and typhoid and established the clinical and pathological features of both diseases in 1836. John Goodsir described the differences in the pathological lesions between typhus and typhoid in 1842. And, of course, typhoid was responsible for more deaths during the Civil War and the Spanish-American War than war-related injuries. More than 80,000 soldiers died of typhoid fever during the Civil War alone. In 1874, Leyden linked typhoid to symptoms in the nervous system. For some time after that, typhoid would be described as brain fever or nervous fever. During the mid-1800s, Dr. Karl Liebermeister, who had been working with bacteria, assumed that typhoid was caused by a microorganism. He was the first to attempt to demonstrate that typhoid could be spread through drinking water that had been contaminated with the feces of patients who had the disease. In 1873, William Budd, a doctor in Bristol who had been studying intestinal fevers, demonstrated that typhoid was transmitted by a specific toxin that was present in the feces of infected people, and that this toxin could contaminate water and spread the disease. In 1879, Dr. Carl Joseph Eberth discovered the bacillus in the abdominal lymph nodes and the spleens of infected patients. His observations were published in 1880 and 1881. Several German and English bacteriologists, including another hero of mine, Robert Koch, confirmed Eberth's findings. The genus Salmonella was named after Daniel Elmer Salmon, an American veterinary pathologist who was the administrator of the USDA research program at the time. Salmon was only one of many who worked with the pathogen, but his standing with the USDA earned him a bacterium. In 1885, German bacteriologist Richard Pfeiffer discovered the presence of typhoid-causing bacterium in stool samples taken from patients suffering from typhoid fever. Austrian pathologist Hans Chiari successfully cultured typhoid bacillus from the gallbladders of typhoid patients in 1894. 1896 was a big year for typhoid. In 1896, the first vaccine for typhoid was found. Richard Pfeiffer and Wilhelm Kohl demonstrated that inoculation with killed typhoid bacteria resulted in immunity against typhoid fever. That same year, French physicians Émile Accard and Raoul Bensade isolated Salmonella paratyphi B and were the first to use the term paratyphoid fever. Also in 1896, George Waddell developed a diagnostic test to detect typhoid fever using serum from patients who were recovering from the disease. And British bacteriologist Amroth Wright developed the first effective vaccine against typhoid using inactivated bacterium. This vaccine would be approved for military use. In 1904, bacteriologists at the U.S. Army proposed using a killed typhoid bacilli oral vaccine as a prophylaxis against typhoid fever. Of the 13 men who ingested the vaccine, 7 developed typhoid fever, and 3 suffered from febrile illness. In 1909, U.S. Army physician Frederick F. Russell perfected the typhoid vaccine. This would be the first vaccine used against typhoid in the United States. Russell began by immunizing volunteers in the Army. After proving the safety and efficacy with volunteers, the vaccine would become mandatory for the military. In 1914, the vaccine was made available to the general public. Okay, Eric, here's the moment you've been waiting for. The story of Typhoid Mary. Mary Mellon was born in Ireland in 1869. She emigrated to the United States in 1883 or 1884. Between the years of 1900 and 1907, over 24 people fell ill with typhoid fever in residences where Mary worked as a cook. But by the time the disease could be traced back to her, she would disappear. She would continue to do this throughout her entire career. By 1906, Mary had found a job as a cook in the home of a wealthy New York banker named Charles Henry Warren. He had rented the home on Oyster Bay for the summer so his family could enjoy the time away from the city. Between August 27th and the 3rd of September, 6 of the 11 people who were living in the home had developed typhoid fever. At the time, typhoid fever had about a 10% mortality rate and mainly affected those living in large cities and squalid conditions. This was not a large city, and it was anything but squalid. The family employed George Soper, a sanitary engineer, to investigate the outbreak. Soper originally believed that the illness was caused by contaminated water. Soper did talk with family members and domestics in the house, but he didn't hit on Mary right away. After Mary's employment ended, she went to work for other families as a cook in Manhattan. Soper began to follow Mary around, and he found that she was a healthy carrier of typhoid fever. His surveillance of Mary began in March of 1907, and he found that she had served 8 families, and of those families, 22 people had become ill with typhoid fever. Soper tried to obtain blood, urine, and fecal samples from Mary, but she would literally chase him off. At least once she chased him off with a carving fork. She would insist that she had not been sick a day in her life, so she couldn't be the cause of the outbreak. So Soper enlisted the help of Dr. Biggs of the New York Department of Health, who sent Dr. Josephine Baker and the police to bring Mary in for testing. Mary hid from the police and Dr. Baker for 5 hours before she was finally taken into custody and forced to give samples. Of course, Mary's samples tested positive, and she was taken to North Brother Island, where she was quarantined. During her confinement, 120 of 163 of her samples tested positive for Salmonella typhi. Mary's case caught the attention of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper baron. Her story was first told in the New York American on June 20th of 1909. When interviewed, she commented, quote, "It seems incredible that in a Christian community, a defenseless woman can be treated in this manner." End quote. Poor Mary. Hearst was known to give money to anyone whose story provided good copy. And in Mary's case, he provided her with a legal team to fight her case. But Hearst's reporters were also the ones to coin the phrase Typhoid Mary. So, on one hand, he helped her get her legal team together and probably even helped free her from the hospital. But on the other hand, his team made her famous as a carrier of a deadly disease. In 1909, she appealed the U.S. Supreme Court for her release, and she lost that appeal. The Greater New York Charter gave state health authorities the power to quarantine the sick by force if necessary. Now here's where we come to the ethical dilemma of the Typhoid Mary story. Some say that she was treated unfairly, that no one bothered to explain the seriousness of her condition to her. and that she didn't understand that she was spreading disease to people far and wide. Poor Mary. I call BS. She had been in confinement for 2 years when the hospital offered to remove her gallbladder so that she would no longer be a carrier, but she refused that surgery. Okay, so on one hand, good for her. I don't think I'd want a gallbladder taken out or any other surgery done in 1909, truthfully. But consider this. I know that medical technology wasn't what it is today. I know that attitudes and such were different back then. But wouldn't you think that a doctor who wanted to perform major surgery on a patient would explain why they were performing that surgery? Don't you think that he explained the choice he gave her? And even before that, don't you think that the health department talked to Mary about why they wanted samples? Now let's look at Mary. She made a huge effort not to give those samples. If you don't think the health department is correct in their assumptions, wouldn't you give up the samples just to prove you were right? I mean, I would. Instead, she hid for 5 hours and assaulted Soper when he confronted her. Now, granted, Mary Mallon was not highly educated, but she knew enough to stay out of reach for as long as she could. By 1910, she had been unsuccessfully treated with several drugs and laxatives and geotropin and brewer's yeast. But a new health commissioner came on board and promised that he would set Mary free if she would agree to working as a domestic, but not as a cook. Mary agreed. But this agreement was kind of on the honor system, and Mary wasn't very honorable. She didn't like making beds. She liked being in charge, and as a cook, she would be in charge. Cooks were very, very highly regarded in the domestic world. Besides, who could resist her signature dish, peach ice cream? Now keep in mind that typhoid is killed by heat, but it survives very well in cold food. Anyway, Mary went off, she changed her name several times, and she continued to find employment as a cook. And she passed typhoid fever all around the city of New York. While employed as a cook at Sloan Maternity in Manhattan, she infected at least 25 people in 3 months. 2 of those people died. She also worked at a sanatorium in Newfoundland, New Jersey, where there was an outbreak. Soper finally tracked her down again in 1915. At that time, she was working in a suburban home in Westchester County, New York. Mary was again taken into custody and quarantined on North Brother Island. In 1932, she suffered a stroke. The stroke left her paralyzed, and she never walked again. Mary died on November 11, 1938, of a heart attack. In all, she spent 26 years of her life in confinement at North Brother Island. 51 original cases of typhoid fever and 3 deaths were attributed to Mary Mallon directly. Countless others were attributed to her indirectly. Mary Mallon was the first known case of typhoid carried by an asymptomatic carrier. But she wasn't the last. There have been many typhoid Marys, and unfortunately, they all have similar stories. Today, North Brother Island is an uninhabited bird sanctuary. It was built in the late 19th century as a quarantine hospital for smallpox victims. By the time Mary was housed there, it was a quarantine facility for anyone who had a communicable disease. There are more stories, though. In the fall of 1921, another outbreak of typhoid fever was tracked to the Penn Pants Company in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Dr. C.S. Reber, a state health department representative, came in and launched an investigation. He found that 52 people had fallen ill and 28 of those tested positive for typhoid fever. The factory employed about 400 people at the time, and the health department was doing everything they could to stop the outbreak. Eventually, this outbreak would reach Reading. Hospitals would be overwhelmed, and 95 cases would be reported. The health department closed the cafeteria at the factory, but the rest of the factory remained open. However, there were workers who refused to report for duty during that outbreak. In the end, water and cafeteria food were ruled out. It was suspected that the outbreak at the factory was caused by an asymptomatic carrier, but they never found out who that carrier was. Now, as an aside, I want to tell you that workers at the factory were offered the vaccine for typhoid in order to stop the outbreak. Out of 400 workers, only 100 volunteered to take the vaccine. Is that familiar? But wait, there's one more. In 1923, a woman working in a delicatessen in Salt Lake City, Utah, became ill with typhoid fever. She was weak and had diarrhea, but she didn't want to leave her boss short-handed, so she decided to work through it. Between running to the bathroom and not properly washing her hands, she served food to customers. One day, a family of 4 adults and 2 teenagers had come to town to see a movie, and they stopped by the deli for food. The 4 adults shared the food while the teens left for the movies. All 4 adults came down with typhoid fever, and 2 of them died. In the end, 188 cases of typhoid fever were directly attributed to the woman behind the counter at the deli. It will never be known how many indirect cases she caused. The outbreak was traced back to the deli by the health department, and the business was quarantined. And shortly after, the number of cases subsided. Okay. Let's get back to medical research for a few minutes. In 1948, researcher Theodore Woodward published the first report on the use of chloramphenicol as a treatment for typhoid fever. This drug would become one of the gold standard drugs for treatment. In 1953, furazolidone would also be introduced as a treatment for typhoid fever. Ampicillin would be introduced in 1961. An outbreak of typhoid fever in 1963 in Zermatt, Switzerland, would affect tourists at a ski resort. 437 cases would be reported, along with 3 deaths. In 1972, amoxicillin would be introduced as a treatment for typhoid fever. It would not only prove to be effective against the disease, but would also reduce the risk of the carrier state. In 1986, researchers at the NIH developed an injectable subunit VI polysaccharide vaccine. Multi-drug resistant typhoid fever would be found in Tajikistan in 1996 and 1997. Somewhere between 8,000 and 17,000 cases and 150 deaths would be estimated. Contamination of the municipal water system would be found as the cause. In 2007, live attenuated vaccine DV-STM-07 would be developed. Several outbreaks and epidemics are reported every year across the globe, and typhoid remains endemic in much of the developing world. Multi-drug resistance is now a challenge for treatment. Clean water and food sources are becoming scarce in many countries, and vaccines are not always available. It seems like I tell this part of the story a lot. There are places in the world where things that we take for granted are totally absent. This is my never-ending story, unfortunately. So there's typhoid fever, and a few of the typhoid Marys that were responsible for outbreaks. I really encourage all of you to look through the show notes and click on a few of the links I provide to find out more about the topics I talk about. I can't talk about everything that I read through when I do research, so there are a few extras in there to peruse. As always, thank you for listening to Cause of Death 100 Seconds to Midnight. Please share these episodes with all your friends and visit the website for ways that you can contact me and support the show. I'll see you in 2 weeks when I talk about cholera.